Poetry Junkies. I really love your title. Thank you for having me and thank you for coming today. I don't know what it is doing for all of you, but it's absolutely freezing here. It's
Oh,
really
uh,
freezing. And
it's
uh,
mellow and rainy here. And I just want to say this community has kept me sane during the pandemic. And I am just so grateful that you joined us. And I'm grateful to everyone who's here today.
you go back that far during the pandemic. Well, that's a great, I think a lot of communities coalesced at that time, and a lot of poetry communities were founded, and book clubs and reading groups. I visited a number of them because I told people that if their book club read the memoir, I would visit the book club on Zooms. So I did a lot of them, you know, and I realized, well, that was a nice way to sell the books, but then I had to do all of these. I didn't think anyone would take me up on it.
You're
Yeah.
kidding. Really
No,
didn't think anyone. Oh,
no, because book clubs, they have a hard time deciding on what they want to read. And, it's a collective decision usually. So anyway, I thought I'd start out with some poems from the new book of poetry, um, rather than going back to the kernel at this moment. And if you like, after a while, I could read a couple of excerpts from the early book and also the memoir. But I thought I'd start with the poems because you are a poetry group, and um, the kernel was written. Oh gosh, no, I don't want to say 44 years ago, something like that. So it feels like a really kind of an old poem. This book, The Lateness of the World, was composed over a period of 17 years. Uh, and it really was ready to publish, I thought, after 13 years. But the publisher wanted to publish the memoir first and then the poetry book a year later. And the memoir wasn't finished. I didn't begin the memoir for 23 years after my return from El Salvador. And I procrastinated. I thought, well, I'm not ready. I have to be a little more mature. I have to wait for time to pass. I had all kinds of reasons why it wasn't the time to write it. And really, I was just actually terrified of writing it. I'm always terrified of writing. The blank page is really difficult to face. But after I started, Ilya Kaminsky is the one who pushed me to start because he said, he's much younger than me. And he said, "You're not getting any younger," and thank you, Ilya. So he said, "You're running out of time." So I said, okay. So I started it, and it took me 15 years to finish that book. So because I started over 4 times. I wrote it 4 times, and I didn't like the first 3. So I tried one more time with the stipulation that if this one failed, I just would give it up and put it on the shelf and admit that I couldn't do it. But anyway, the lateness of the world waited for the memoir to be finished for 3 years. And happily enough, I always knew there was a hole in it. There was something missing from the book. And a flood of poems came a year before it was published, and completely settled things. It completely filled the hole. So this is the longest period of time between books I've ever had, is this one. But I don't care anymore about periods of time, and 17 years doesn't seem that long to me anymore. And I think it's okay to be slow as a poet or writer. I don't think there's any rule that you have to come out with a book every couple of years. And I never did that from the time I was young. And I think it's because I felt that I had to live and take in life. And the poems that I wrote had to be urgent and necessary, but they also had to come to fruition, during this living. So that takes a lot of time. I'm going to begin with a poem called Museum of Stones, which is the first poem of the book. It's an invocation poem, and it comes from, most of my poems come from remembered experience, and this one is for a Irish musician who was a busker. He traveled around, playing on the street with a hat on they collect the coins, and very interesting person. He always chose a stone from his travels and he mounted it on a wall. And he would label each stone. He put it on a prong and he'd label the little block it was on, exactly where the stone came from. And they were just ordinary pebbles and things. And he would write, from beneath the Eiffel Tower, July 1977. Very particular labels on each one. So it was really a beautiful museum of nothing, of ordinary rocks. And I liked it. So I asked him if I could do it too. And he said, sure, everybody should have their own museum. And this is a cheap one to do. So I started to collect stones too. And I already had been picking them up before I saw his museum, but I didn't have the discipline to label them. So they all wound up in a bag, which they're still in, and they're all different stones from all over the world. And I have no idea where anything is from anymore. So I thought about it I think when I get older, I will bury them in a hole for some future geologist to puzzle about. But this is what I wrote this for him after he died. Museum of Stones. These are your stones, assembled in matchbox and tin, collected from roadside, culvert and viaduct, battlefield, threshing floor, basilica, abattoir. Stones loosened by tanks in the streets, from a city whose earliest map was drawn in ink on linen. Schoolyard stones in the hand of a corpse. Pebble from Baudelaire's We, stone of the mind within us, carried from one silence to another. Stone of cromlech and cairn, schist and shale, hornblende, agate, marble, millstones, ruins of choirs and shipyards, chalk, marl, mudstone from temples and tombs. Stone from the silvery grass near the scaffold. Stone from the tunnel lined with bones. Lava of a city's entombment. Stones chipped from lighthouse, cell wall, scriptorium. Paving stones from the hands of those who rose against the army. Stones where the bells had fallen, where the bridges were blown. Those that had flown through windows, weighted petitions, feldspar, rose quartz, blue schist, Nice, and Chert. Fragments of an abbey at dusk. Sandstone toe of a Buddha, mortared at Bamiyan. Stone from the hill of 3 crosses and a crypt. From a chimney where storks cry like human children. Stones newly fallen from stars, a stillness of stones, a heart, altar and boundary stone, marker and vessel, first cast, load and hail, bridge stones and others to pave and shut up with, stone apple, stone basil, beechberry, stone break. Concretion of the body, as blind, as cold, as deaf. All earth a quarry, all life a labor, stone-faced, stone drunk with hope that this assemblage of rubble taken together would become a shrine or holy place, an ossuary, immovable and sacred, like the stone that marked the path of the sun as it entered the human dawn. This poem is related to another poem in the book. And let's see where I have. And this place referred to at the end that lit the path of the sun is a place in Ireland also. And it's Newgrange, you know it by. It has an Irish name too, but it's called Newgrange. And I wrote a poem after visiting Newgrange, and it was a very startling place because it was built by Neolithic children when the life expectancy was 25 years. And they hollowed out of the earth these passages and circular rooms. And there are a number of them all through Europe. They're not completely sure what they were used for, but they believe they were used ceremoniously and probably having something to do with death. But there was one passage tomb. You have to squeeze to get in there, and you go through, you don't want to go if you have too much claustrophobia, but you'll go through this narrow little passageway and you come into a room that's shaped like a beehive. And it's beautiful, and it's been airtight without a drop of moisture in thousands of years, 5,000 years or whatever. They don't know how they did it, but it's so tight and so beautifully built. And what was explained to us is that the little opening that you can still see the world through that tunnel, on the solstice, when the sun rises, precisely when the sun rises, if there are no clouds in the sky, which is a rare event in Ireland, you have to buy lottery tickets to be in this beehive when this happens. I've never won the lottery to be there, but I've always wanted to. But my luck would be clouds. Anyway, this fascinating thing is that the sun would pierce through and light the room and turn it all golden with light for 17 minutes. And that was it. And then the light would go up, that was it for the year. It's the only time that the tomb was lit from within. So this is called the Refuge of Art. And it was actually also written for a painter who lives in France, in Normandy. And he liked to paint with pigmented cement. And he liked to paint stone walls and scratch things into them and so on. So it's called the Refuge of Art. In an atelier, once a shoe factory, an artisan paints walls, cromlechs and cairns with pigmented stone dust, dolmens with markings from an unknown past, horses chiseled in chalk on blue stone, a huntsman's frieze in Paleolithic time. Slate tiles light his visual over stags in flight, bison stampeding, wild oryx and lyre-shaped horns, horses galloping his walls, and upon them serpents, spirals, lozenges, and stars. In the dawn of humanity, children built passage tombs for the dead, stone hives in the earth for the hum of spirit. At solstice still, the sun enters their chambers precisely for 17 minutes. Certain years, also the moon. Wintering swans fly over as the stars hiss out. In hollow pits, the dead repose, bones whitening in utter dark, where not even bats sing. And until seen from the air by pilots during the Great War, the domes slept, round and risen in the fields. They also saw their own jeweled cities, their chess villages, quilts of crops and snake of rivers, snow wounded by wire not seen before. And after the war, the pilots led engineers to the fields of the domes. At first, no one knew what they were. Nothing was known. Not that the builders would have been children to them, nor why they toiled their lives, moving stones for the sun to slip through on a winter dawn, lighting the spirals, stars, and lozenges that the artist now transcribes, along with wild oryx, bison, and ancient horse. It is not known why he paints them, standing as he does in a slate blindness, only that with time he might decipher a message regarding oryx, bisons, spirals, lozenges, and stars. So these poems in this book are not, it's not, my third and fourth books were kind of book-length poems. They were sequences of poems and big projects. And I didn't want to do any more projects. So I decided to write a book of poems. No, just a book of poems, ordinary individual poems ordered in a certain way, the way we used to do. And you don't really have much choice in this anyway, and that's how the poems started coming out. Nothing experimental about them at all. You know, first person lyric narratives. But I did learn as I was pulling them together, the ones that survived, that I let be in the book, the ones I decided to keep, they all seem to be talking to each other. Every poem talks to another poem in the book, and those are the two that are talking there. And there in this book, there's a lot of birds, lighthouses, migrations, water, boats. It's really a lot of sea in the book, and some more about writing than I ever did before. It's about crossings and yeah. So I'm going to read The Boatman next, which is a poem that I taught on a Greek island for 8 years now. And the first one was Seriphos, and after that, Thassos, which is in the northern Aegean. And it was right next to Lesbos, which is the island where the refugee camps were set up with refugees who were really fleeing Libya, Syria, all of North Africa, Iraq, Afghanistan. And they were, a lot of those boats, as you know, and still are, tipping into the sea, and people were drowning in the Aegean, and those that made it wound up in these camps. And the Greeks were trying to save as many people as they could, and then it was made illegal to do that. It was illegal to help refugees, to pull them onto the beach or pick them up in your fishing boat, and the Greeks are not known to obey laws that much. I mean, they ignore, well, especially tax laws, but they just kept, the Greeks that I knew just kept helping. And then one winter, I found myself in Milwaukee, Wisconsin at Marquette University. It's cold there in the winter. I chose the wrong semester. Well, I lived downtown in a hotel and I walked to campus. And most days I said, well, I'll just take the bus when it's too cold. Well, or take a taxi when the bus won't come. I wound up in the taxi a lot. And there was 100 taxis floating around downtown, but this one driver coincidentally kept picking me up. He always seemed to be where I was, and he noticed it too. And he said, I recognize you. And I said, you too. And I looked at his name, and I did something I never do. I asked him where he was from. And he said, I'm from Homs in Syria. And of course, Homs had just been all over the news because it was completely flattened by aerial bombardment, and everything was destroyed in Homs. And I said, how did you get here? And why, Milwaukee? And it was snowing. It was always snowing. It was snowing. And he pulled up in front of my hotel and he turned off the ignition, turned off everything. And the snow covered the car, covered the windows. And he started to talk. And he said, I'm going to tell you, but since you are, you have to promise me you'll write about it someday. When people tell you things, they always say that you have to write about this, and you can't always do that because you have no control over that matter, whether you can write it or not. But accidentally I did. The poem came, and so a lot of this is it's his story. The Boatman. We were 31 souls, he said, in the gray sick of sea, in a cold rubber boat rising and falling in our filth. By morning, this didn't matter. No land was in sight. All were soaked to the bone, living and dead. We could still float, we said, from war to war. What lay behind us but ruins of stone, piled on ruins of stone. City called Mother of the Poor, surrounded by fields of cotton and millet. City of jewelers and cloak makers, with the oldest church in Christendom and the sword of Allah. If anyone remains there now, he assures they would be utterly alone. There is a hotel named for it in Rome, 200 meters from the Piazza di Spagna, where you can have breakfast under the portraits of film stars. There, the staff cannot do enough for you. But I am talking nonsense again, as I have since that night we fetched a child, not ours, from the sea, drifting face down in a life vest, its eyes taken by fish or the birds above us. After that, Aleppo went up in smoke, and Raqqa came under a rain of leaflets, warning everyone to go. Leave, yes, but go where? We lived through the Americans and Russians, through Americans again, many nights of death from the clouds, mornings surprised to be waking from the sleep of death, still unburied and alive, with no safe place. Leave, yes, we'll obey the leaflets, but go where? To the sea, to be eaten? To the shores of Europe, to be caged? To camp misery and camp remain here? I ask you then, where? You tell me you are. If so, our destination is the same. I find myself now the boatman driving a taxi at the end of the world. I will see that you arrive safely, my friend. I will get you there. So, I can read you one that's a little bit complex. I was invited to Indonesia. These were the new ones, the ones that came at the very end while the book was waiting for the other book. And I got invited to a conference on plastic waste in the oceans. And interestingly, the Indonesians not only invited the marine biologists and the oceanographers and all other scientists, they also invited artists, musicians, and poets. Why? Because they wanted us to understand the situation, and they were hoping this knowledge would infuse our works, and that those works would then move people to take an interest in plastic waste in the oceans. Because you see, they understand how poetry works in the world, how it subtly moves through the world, and how it affects the human heart, which is something the man who mentored me in Salvador also understood. You know, he wanted a poet to come to Salvador, because a lot of people in other cultures realize the power of poetry. I haven't seen that so much in our culture, but they realize the power of poetry, acknowledge it. The dictators fear it and always imprison the poets. But people who have their eyes open and are concerned with things generally understand not just poetry, but art and music and all the art forms have this effect on the culture. So they asked us to come. Anyway, there was two things that happened. Well, a couple things happened. One was that Boeing 737 MAX 8, one of the crashes happened while we were there, right off the coast of where we were. A plane crash. Everybody was killed, and it went into the Sea of Borneo, I believe. Anyway, we were there on the non-tourist side of Bali. And so that happened, and they were trying to figure out why the plane crashed, and it was very mysterious. Nobody understood. And also, I kept hearing a singing sound in the forest around where we were, and I thought it was a bird, and I kept asking, "What's that bird? What's that bird?" And it wasn't a bird. I found out what it was, and I didn't realize that that could happen. So I'm going to, then a lot of realizations about environmental collapse came to me while I was writing the poem. And I'll read it now. I didn't want you to get lost, which is why this big introduction. Report from an island. Sea washes the sands in a frill of salt and a yes sound. We lie beneath palms under the star constellations of the global south. A cross, a sword pointing upward. Through frangipani trees, a light wind. Bats foraging. Foreigners smoke the bats out by burning coconuts, calling this the bat problem. Or they set out poisonous fruit. The gecko hides under a banana leaf. So far, nothing is said. A gecko, mistaken for a bird that sings in the night. It is no bird. A healer blows smoke into a wound, sees through flesh to a bone once broken. In the sea, they say, there is an island made of bottles and other trash. Plastic bags become clouds, and the air a place for opportunistic birds. 1.5 million plastic pounds makes their way there every hour. The pellets are eggs to the seabirds, and the bags, jellyfish to the turtle. So it is with diapers, shampoo, razors and snack wrappers, soda rings and six-pack holders. Even the sacks to carry it all home flow to the sea. Wind has lofted the water in a distant city, according to news reports. Most of that city submerged now with fish in the streets. It is no bird. The man hasn't sold any of his carved dolphins. Geckos don't sing. The vendor of sarongs hasn't sold a single one. Prow, the boats are called throughout this archipelago, spider-looking, soft-motored, waiting at dawn. Geckos can't blink, so they lick their own eyes to keep them wet. Their bite is gentle. They eat mealworms and crickets. This is why no crickets sing. No one talks about it. But people look to the sea, toward where the plane went down. There is time to imagine 189 souls buckled to their seats on the sea floor. The wind too much for the plane. The gecko now at the door. After the earthquake, people moved into the family tombs. Many graves now have light and running water. Others live in the dumps in trash cities, where there is work sorting plastic, metal, glass, tantalum from cell phones and precious earths. This work is slow. A low hum of ordinary life drills into the mind like the sound of insects devouring a roof. There is no hope for it. There is only the sea and its yes, lights in the city of the dead, and a plastic island that must, from space, appear to be a palace. That is one of my few environmental poems. I haven't written very many of them. And we'll read it one more Indonesia poem. When I was going there, you know those shadow puppets that on the sticks there. I've always been fascinated by them, and I'm going to Indonesia. I want to buy shadow puppet. And now realizing, of course, that the shadow puppets are from a particular part of Indonesia, and I wasn't going to that part, or not where the puppets prevailed. And I never saw any puppets the whole time I was there for sale anywhere. And a strange thing happened. Where we were staying, all of us scientists and musicians and things, it was right on the sea, and there was a walkway along the sea, and there were people with blankets selling things, and one of the men who was the brother of someone selling things came up to me, and I had not said a word about puppets. And he said, "Do you like shadow puppets?" And I said, "Yes." He said, "Okay, do you want a shadow puppet?" And I said, "Yes, I really want a shadow puppet." And he said, "Okay, come with me." He had a little scooter. He said, "I'm going to take you to my brother. He makes shadow puppets. And where he lives has been completely destroyed by a monsoon hurricane storm. It took down his house, but his little hut where he makes the puppets is still standing." And he said, I'll take you there and he'll make you a puppet." So I was so overwhelmed with the desire to have a puppet that I got on that scooter and let this guy take me wherever. Okay. I went with him. And sure enough, he took me through these back roads to this village you can't see from the road, a village that was totally demolished, and people were living in tents and things. And he took me into his brother's hut where he makes the puppets. And it was very strange because I asked him how he knew I wanted a puppet, and he said, "I don't know. I just came into my head when I saw you." The last puppet. Moonlight taps on the puppet maker's hut. The tip of a brush touching hide, light falling into water from an egret's wings, like tears on glass. Stones dusted with ash, taps as if someone were there attempting to wake us up. A bell ringing in a tomb of cloud. This debris is the puppet maker's house, taken by a sudden wind, a storm like the future, filled with pigs, trees, cars, and something no one should wish to see. Fires on the seafloor, burnt weather, the once soft air embalmed in salt, as if God said it. They kill the snake, drain its blood into a glass of liquor, along with its still beating heart. Not everyone does this. You drink it, and later you chew and chew the strong muscle of snake. In another place, the blood of fruit bats is given without the heart. No one knows the difference this makes. Souls have their own world. The corpse, its bone cage. Nothing but fire everywhere the fire finds air. There are no hides left. This is the last puppet. The puppet maker lifts it to the light and has it speak a language it will never speak again. Its shadow finding the shadow on the wall of no one else. Then he puts a last song in its mouth. Souls have their own world. They are the descendants of clouds. Take this puppet to America. Hold it to the light. Do you want to talk for a minute? Do you have any questions? I usually like to break things up a little in a session like this. And if you have, yes, Chandra, did you raise your hand? Probably not. Okay.
No, I was clapping.
Okay, thank you. Carolyn, hi, nice to see you.
Hi, Carolyn. Hola, Carolina, tocaya.
I didn't know I was
That's
here. This is great.
Yeah, that's Spanish for a person who has the same name.
Yeah.
So yeah, Carolina. We're both Carolina, spelled the same in Spanish, different
Yeah.
in English. Yeah. Anyway, I just wanted to ask you. I mean, you've been. I love your comment about writing slowly and getting books out with great intervals in between, so that by the time they emerge, they are very ready. They are in the ripeness of the world. So that's wonderful. But I wanted to ask, what are you working on now? What projects are underway?
Well, it was the reason I went to Prague. I'm actually working on prose. I'm working on a second memoir.
All
It's
right.
actually possibly nearly done, but I've been writing it for many years alongside the other one. And it has nothing to do with the other one. It takes place mostly in Central Europe, and it's about poetry and friendship and history and political upheaval and friendship and poetry. Everybody in it is a poet, I think, except for my relatives. And so that's what I'm doing. I'm writing this thing, and I'm writing little short prose pieces also that aren't connected to that. I don't know what those are going to be. And I'm writing notes. I'm writing notes of poems, lines of poems. But no, I've only got about 3 or 4 new ones written. Very many. In fact, I should have pulled those up for today, but anyway, that I'm just writing. I'm always writing. The thing I think might be finished the soonest is probably that second memoir, which has no title. They never have a title till the very end. So I don't know what it is, but it has Ilya's in it a lot. Ilya Kaminsky. I hope you know his work.
Oh, yes,
he's
I
there.
know him. Yeah.
Yeah. He's there. He's a character in it.
I,
And
I'll mention a name. Richard Katrovas.
he's not in it.
Oh, he's
No.
not in it. He used to tell
No.
all kinds of huge mythological stories about you. It was amazing.
I'm
But
sure.
that
I'm
was
sure
40
he
years
did.
ago.
He was a friend, but he's not a character in the book. The
Ah,
character
okay.
is my friend Daniel Simcoe, who died
yeah.
in 2004.
Yeah.
Ilya, Daniel, there's a few friendships in it, and they were very close friendships. No, just Richard's not there. The only time I saw Richard in Prague was when I taught in his program. So,
Ah,
yeah. I didn't really ever see him there otherwise. And he hadn't moved to Prague yet during my time there. So any other? Elizabeth,
May I?
thanks.
Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
I'm just looking
Oh.
at the little golden hands raised.
Mine's too
Thanks.
Caucasian to be seen.
Oh, I see it. I see it now. Okay, Elizabeth and then Roxy.
Awesome. Thank you. Oh, thank you, Carolyn. This is just wonderful. And I just wanted to say, I love how your openness to let in all these voices, like the voice of the boatman and people that, and bring them out so that we can all hear and appreciate. And I don't know what my question was exactly, but I just, do you kind of like search the world, or you just keep yourself open? Oh, if that, I don't know if that's the right thing, but I love that it's like this sense of, or even a puppet, right? Bring this puppet to America, it's like, let it speak, let it, and it's so much more than a puppet, right? And just bringing us close to our humanity, it's helping us see one another's humanity, and even, the earth isn't separate from us either. I don't know what my question is, but if there's anything you can say more about that, or that sense of openness that you have.
There's a lot of people who talk in my poems. It always has been. Angel of
Yeah.
History is really dominated. That poem is really dominated by my hospital roommate in Paris, who talked my ear off for a week. And, my grandmother talks a lot in my first book, and there's a lot of other voices in my work. And I think I like listening to people, and I remember what they say. Sometimes I write down what they say, but usually I remember it. And they come back when I'm writing. They come back and they start taking over the poems. And I let them. So because I think of maybe part of my process is a many-voiced process, multi-voiced, like polyphonic, where you have more than one, like a chorus almost of sensibilities. So of course, they're all flowing through me. They're all shaped by me. You know, I understand that. But sometimes it's easier to put things in the mouth of someone else, you know, than to say it yourself. So, but see, on a one level, I don't really control that matter. So I do like to talk to people, and I do, because I travel alone a lot, as any of you who travel alone know, if you strike up a conversation with a stranger, you'll know much more about them than you know about your own family within about 2 hours, you know, because they know they won't see you again, so they tell you everything. And I've always found those, not always, I found often them to be very interesting. Not always, but I don't I don't write entirely. I don't really write in the first person. They're not persona. It's the poem as an act of listening and telling other people what someone said. I'm not trying to be them. Yeah.
So I
So
like,
I'm always myself in the poem. I'm the I, and they are the other person talking. I can't do persona for some reason. It's the same reason I can't write fiction. I have this block about that level of invention, and I'm not sure what that's about. And Roxy,
Oh,
and
thank you.
Lisa,
I also am completely blown away and grateful. And I just wanted to make a quick observation, then try to form it into a question. And as someone who's been reading you for years and being part of poetry communities, and there's sometimes unkind discourse around what kinds of ideologies and poetry cultures it's okay to be amongst. I remember as a young one in the 80s and 90s thinking as an activist, I want to do what Carolyn is doing. I want to be a poet of witness too. And then there was this kind of moment, which we don't have to rehearse for everybody here, where poetry of witness came under the scrutiny of people like the language poets, et cetera. And it kind of fell into more disrepair, as though, I guess, traveling as an outsider, speaking as an insider was a form of colonization. And I always remember the moment in 1990 at Aspen Writers Conference with you, where you talked about this inward facing process of writing, this transmission. The poem comes to you, it may not. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit, if you've learned anything about what poetry of witness, if you even use that term, means to you, because I think of that as very outward facing and very respectful. I can't even believe what an amazing storyteller you are. You know, it's like you can't help it. But what's the relationship between that real outward facing listening to others, almost journalistic stance, investigative poetry, as Edward Sanders would say, and your more, what I think of maybe a spiritual inward facing, the composing moment? Do you think that your intense outward facingness informs the inward facingness? Or what's
that's
the
a lot of
relationship between
questions,
those two
Roxy.
things? Well, okay. That's
will
why I said I
try.
wanted
Okay.
it to. No, well,
I'm gonna
what's the
make
relationship between poetry of witness and writing?
Okay, what I want to say about that is, first of all, the language poets are very conceptual. They're not just against people writing out of their own experience, you know, or
Yeah,
their own, what they've seen and heard and felt and lived politically. They're against doing that at all, you know,
for
because
sure.
that's a subjective human creation of a human subjectivity, which they would consider to be false. And they like conceptual, they like to work with language conceptually. And I've read them, and I've read a lot of that. And I don't, that's not where I work. So
Oh, I know. Yeah.
when the Country Between Us came out, it was attacked quite a lot in
Yeah.
various ways by various institutions and people. It was also praised, but it was praised for equally weird reasons. It was praised because of its subject matter, which is never really a reason to praise poetry. And it was condemned for the same reason. And I found that this was a weird, there was something disturbing to American readers about anything that touched the third rail of what they considered political. And so I had to figure this out because I knew I wasn't yet somebody I would consider a political person. Even when I got back from Salvador, I wasn't. I was somebody who was moved morally, ethically, in my conscience, and I wasn't engaged in what Salvadorans would consider political life, where you join a party and you go to meetings every night, and you're under some kind of discipline and you have an ideological line. I wasn't interested in any of that. So, I actually developed this concept of witness, and it's borrowed not from. It's not a judicial term or even a journalistic term. It goes back to, it's almost from the tradition of martyrdom, but the saying of a truth, the saying of a truth. And what I conceived of was that people who had been through things had, whether they had just observed those things, which is also traumatic, if you're there when something terrible happens, or the terrible thing happened to them and their body as well, they're marked. Their language is marked. Their imaginations are marked. They're never the same. This event, this suffering, this whatever they endured stays with them and alters, even if ever so slightly, the tone and the linguistic cosmology of their future work. And so my sense of witness was not reportage. It was this mark, the reading for this trace of extremity. And to give a sort of place for writing that had come out of historical extremity that was the result of depredations of the state, something that people didn't make them, it wasn't personal, it was endured by a collective. And there's a lot of strange and sloppy thinking around issues of colonization and identity and ownership over material and all that. I have no patience for a lot of it.
Yeah.
I understand it. I've read all of it. And fortunately for me, all of my poems are about my own experience. They're not about someone else's experience. It just so happens that my own experience takes place in a lot of different places. And there are historical precedents for that. And if you start to talk about, even people say you shouldn't translate anything because that's, appropriation or something. The things that get said are crazy. And we would lose, if we lose the capacity to imagine the lives of others, we lose all of literature, Eastern and Western.
Yes.
It's gone. So I can't engage those arguments. They're not
Sorry.
they're not thoughtful enough. No, it's not. I'm just saying what I think about them. It's just not thoughtful enough. And it's not complete enough in terms of what people do. Now, on the other hand, I do feel that you have to be, if you have people in your work, whether it's fiction or nonfiction or poetry, who aren't from your own familiar environment, you're not from their culture, it's very important to be respectful and to be and not to falsify or misrepresent in some way. And proof is in the pudding. Individual works have to be judged on how well they did that. I was worried when I published my memoir because I published it at almost the height of you can't write about anybody but yourself and your own family and your backyard and your own race, your own religion and your own identity. And here I was writing a book about another country going through turmoil. But then I realized I wasn't writing a book about another country going through turmoil. I was writing about the transformation of a young person through a kind of an education that was given to her. And what I was writing was, I was writing the journey so that people could go through it on paper. They could read the journey and they would know what happened. And fortunately, I was writing about myself, and my main character wasn't myself. It was a Salvadoran man, and secondarily a Salvadoran woman, and so I didn't worry, and I didn't get attacked at all, for not that I know of. Maybe people, but I haven't heard it. And the Salvadoran community has been really happy about it. So the writers have let me know that, and there've been reading parties and book parties in Salvador. And the people who were characters in the memoir got together without me in Salvador and had a big dinner, and so I didn't fall prey to that. I didn't have to be once again a controversial person, which I dreaded. I don't like to be focused upon in any way, really, but especially in that way.
Well, I regret framing my question with that, because that's painful and old stuff. I was more interested, I think, in the whole notion of how poetry as a form transmits information in a way that is necessary to people, like investigative poetry, and that's why it's dangerous as opposed to journalism.
Yeah,
Because I think your poetry is that.
poetry that considers the world and brings it to life on paper, and in a true way, in a way that honors what actually happened. That's how the human heart is moved. Yeah. That's why Lionel didn't want a journalist, although I thought he should have a journalist. He wanted a poet. He said, when the time comes, we'll be crawling with journalists. We'll have all kinds of journalists. I don't need a journalist, And because I was raised in the United States, I didn't view poetry the way he did, and I realized I didn't even think it was as important as he thought it was. I thought it was my own private Idaho, it was my own thing that I did. And when I was a little girl, I didn't even know there were other living poets. I thought, well, I like doing this. I never attached it to anything. The way kids start doing things and they don't even imagine anything that would come of it, or anybody would even look at it. In fact, I didn't want people to see what I wrote when I was young. I would always cover it up, and my father's feelings would be hurt because I'd huddle over the typewriter so he wouldn't see what I'd written. Anyway, that's enough of that. But would you like to hear other poem? Did anybody else have their little golden hand up? So I'm going to read a poem called The Lightkeeper, which is related to the Museum of Stones, because the same person who told me I could have a museum knew that I loved lighthouses. And lighthouse people like to be alone at lighthouses. They don't like other lighthouse people to be walking around. And he told me, you can't go to a lighthouse during the day. It's just a dead building. You have to go at night when the lighthouse is working and it's alive and it's looking out to sea, and it's flashing its light across the sea. And I didn't realize that lighthouses make noise while they're doing this. There's this incredible sound that happens when you're standing really close to a lighthouse at night. Unfortunately, GPS is replacing a lot of them, but this lighthouse is called Hook, and it's right across the water from Crook. So I think by hook or by crook was originally a sailing term or navigation term. And like all poems, it's also about something else. Sometimes poems are about two other things besides the ostensible surface subject. The light keeper, a night without ships, foghorns calling into walled cloud, and you still alive, drawn to the light, as if it were a fire kept by monks. Darkness once crusted with stars, but now death dark as you sail inward. Through wild gorse and sea wrack, through heather and torn wool, you ran, pulling me by the hand so I might see this for once in my life. The spin and spin of light, the whirring of it. Light in search of the lost, there since the era of fire, era of candles and hollow wick lamps, whale oil and solid wick, colza and lard, kerosene and carbide. The signal fires lighted on this perilous coast in the Tower of Hook. You say to me, stay awake. Be like the lens maker who died with his lungs full of glass. Be the yew in blossom when bees swarm, be their amber cathedral, and even the ghosts of Cistercians will be kind to you. In a certain light, as after rain, in pearled clouds, or the water beyond, seen or sensed water, sea or lake, you would stop still and gaze out for a long time. Also, when fireflies opened and closed in the pines and a star appeared, our only heaven. You taught me to live like this, that after death, it would be as it was before we were born. Nothing to be afraid, nothing but happiness, as unbearable as the dread from which it comes. Go toward the light always. Be without ships. I think I'm going to read a grandmother poem. Anna, since we started in Prague on this conversation, which I just got back from my Anna came to America in the early 20th century on a ship. And so this is a poem for her. Her name was Anna. The crossing. No matter how light it was, or wet the fields, and whether or not the horses from the stable down the road had broken their fence and were grazing near our windows, as horses in a dream, Anna would be gone, out pounding the earth with her pronged hoe. She never woke me, although I slept beside her, like sleeping near a hill wrapped in house silk. Her teeth floated in water on the nightstand where she kept her spectacles, this woman who crossed as a girl of my age in the hold of a ship for weeks, lowering her bucket of night soil by rope, then from the sea-rinsed bucket, pouring seawater over herself on the lower deck where bathing was permitted. The salt stiffened her hair and burned her eyes, but she was clean. It isn't what they tell you, Piscla, calling me the name of a little bird that sings too much. If there were no cattle, no horses or sheep to be sold, they would take people whose passage had been paid and whose forfeit put up. Our papers were in order, and we had the passage and forfeit to board. They gave us drinking water, but shut off all water at night. 2 weeks of the rocking boat and stink of buckets, all of us asleep on planks, such rise and fall, such pitch of the ship. But some nights on deck, holding the rails for all her life, she said she plowed the sea as she once had the fields, and into the furrows of light went the seeds, and the black winged waters fell upon them. I ruined that last line, but I tried not to ruin that. Ilya Kaminsky is a very close friend. I went with him to Ukraine in 2004, his first trip back since fleeing Ukraine in 1993. And so we went to Odessa, his natal city, which is now under aerial bombardment pretty continually. And his father had died the year after he got to the United States. Ilya is completely deaf. He's profoundly deaf. He fakes it a lot so people don't think he's deaf, but he is. He doesn't hear. He reads lips very, very well. Exile. The city of your childhood rises between steppe and sea, wheat and light, white with the dust of cockle shells, stargazers, and bones of pipefish. City of limestone, soft enough to cut with a hatchet, where the sea unfurls and acacias brought by Greeks on their ships turn white in summer. So yes, you remember, this is the city you lost. city of smugglers and violinists, chess players and monkeys, an opera house, a madhouse, a ghost church with wind for its choir, where two things were esteemed: literature and ships, poetry and the sea. If you return now, it will not be as a being visible to others. And when you walk past, it will not be as if a man had passed, but rather as if someone had remembered something long forgotten and wondered why. If you return, your father will be alive to prepare for you his mint cucumber soup or give you the little sweet called bird's milk. And after hours of looking with him for his sandals lost near the sea, you visit again together the amusement park where your ancestors are buried, and then go home to the apartment house built by German prisoners of war, to whom your father gave bread, which you remember surprised you. You take the tram to a stop where it is no longer possible to get off. And he walks with you until he vanishes, still holding in his own your invisible hand. So I think I'd like to read the Lost Suitcase, if it's okay. I don't know how long these events go. We've already done some talking, but how much time do we have? Okay, the Lost Suitcase, Daniel Simcoe was my very closest friend, my husband's friend, my son's kind of uncle. And as the Velvet Revolution was happening, he called me and he said, we've got to go right now. He said, you need to find your family. I need to get my records and books that I left in the attic. So we made a plan. And a few months after the Václav Havel went to the castle, we decided that we were going to fly to Vienna because we wanted to retrace a journey that Daniel had taken. We flew to Vienna and we were going to drive across the Danube, across the bridge into Bratislava. Both of our families were from near Bratislava. And then we were going to spend a few days in Bratislava, visit Daniel's family, go and find his books and his jazz records, put them in the car, and then drive to Prague. And so what happened was Daniel had 2 suitcases with him, and he was a smoker. So he was always outside turning against the wind, lighting a cigarette, not paying attention. And one of his suitcases was stolen. And this poem is also about something else. And the reason I'm reading it is because it's about writing. The Lost Suitcase. So it was, with the suitcase left in front of the hotel, cinched, broken locked, papered with world ports, carrying what mattered until then. When turning your back to cup a match, it was taken, and the thief, expecting valuables, instead found books written between wars. Gold attic light, mechanical birds singing, and the chronicle of your country's final hours. What, by means of notes, you hoped to become? A noun on paper dark with nouns. Swallows darting through a basilica, your hands up in smoke, a cloud about to open over the city. Pillows breathing shallowly where you had lain, a ghost in a hospital gown. And here, your voice, principled, tender, soughing through a fence woven with pine boughs. Writing is older than glass, but younger than music. Older than clocks or porcelain, but younger than rope. Dear one who even in speaking is silent. For years I have searched, usually while asleep, when I have found the suitcase open, collecting snow, still holding your vade-mecum of the infinite, your dictionary of the no longer spoken, a commonplace of wounds casually inflicted, and the slender ledger of truly heroic acts. Gone is your atlas of countries unmarked by war, absent your manual for the preservation of ours. The incunabulum is lost, both your earliest book and a hatching place for your mechanical birds. But the collection of aperçus having to do with light laying its eggs in your eyes was found, along with the prophecy that all mass murders were early omens. In an antique bookshop, I found your catechism of atrophied faiths. So I lay you to rest without your psalter, nor the monograph wherein you state your most unequivocal and hard-won proposition, that everything must happen, but to whom doesn't matter. Here are your books as if they were burning. Be near now and wake to tell me who you were. Okay, I'm going to jump to the end of the book. We can talk a little bit more after that, but I have a poem that I don't know where it's from, and then I'll close with the one that's at the end. This one I don't know. I know where the rest of them came from. I can locate these poems' origins in my life somewhere. This one, fairly new, close to the time it was published. I know what it's about, but I don't know where it's from. It just wrote itself. So, okay. Toward the end. In this archipelago of thought, a fog descends. Horns of ships to unseen ships. A year passing overhead. The cry of a year, not knowing where, someone standing in the aftermath who once you knew, the one you were then, a little frisson of recognition, then just like that, gone, and no one for hours. A sound you thought you heard, but in the waking darkness is not heard again. 2 sharp knocks on the door. Death it was, you said, but now nothing. The islands, places you have been, the sea, the uncertain, full of ghosts calling out, lost as they are. No one you knew in your life. The moon above the whole of it, like the light at the bottom of a well, opening in iced air, where you have gone under and come back. Light, no longer tethered to your own past. And were it not for the weather of trance, of haze and murk, you could see everything at once, all the islands, every moment you have lived or place you have been without confusion or bafflement. And you would be one person. You would be one person again. And so I'll close with this last poem. It's called What Comes, and I wrote this when I was in chemotherapy. So it was written out of a little bit of fear. I was trying to talk to myself. So what comes? To speak is not yet to have spoken. The not yet of a white realm of nothing left, neither for itself nor another. A no longer already there, along with the arrival of what has been, light and the reverse of light. Terror, as walking blind along the breaking sea, body in whom I lived. The not yet of death, darkening what it briefly illuminates. An unknown place, as between languages, back and forth, breath to breath, as a calm in the surround rises, fireflies in lindens, an ache of pine. You have yourself within you. Yourself, you have her, and there is nothing that cannot be seen. Open then to the coming of what comes. Okay, those are the poems that I'll read. And do you have any other things you want to talk about or ask?
Well, Carolyn, a notion I've been developing for several years now is that the heart breaks to get bigger. And
Oh,
I want to believe that. And at the same moment, I know that the heart can break to get smaller. So if you could speak a little bit about what kind of things you think we can do as poets to ensure that the kintsugi-like potential of the heart to fill those cracks with gold is fulfilled.
oh, that's a nice image where they repair the bowls and things with gold. You can actually learn that skill. There's even a kit you can get to do it. I've always wanted to do it, but I never have. Okay, what I think is it's not just poets, it's everybody. You know, everybody's heart is broken. If you live long enough, it's broken a lot of times. Some of the breaks are big, some of them smaller, but it's the human condition. And what I think is that we really can't usually control what happens to us. And despite the fact that we have this illusion that we have choices, very often we really don't. You know, we also have a formation, which often determines what choice we will make. So what I've always thought is, okay, I can't control what happens to me, but I can control my response to it. And if you pay attention to how you are responding and try to make that beautiful, it will be okay. You know, if you find yourself getting bitter or getting angry or any of those things, then that is something that you have to release in some way, because it's not about the person that you're bitter about or angry at. The release is for your own self, you know, it's for your own health and peace and well-being in the future. Forgiveness is for you, not for the person you're forgiving, you know? So that's what when my students ask me about that, that's what I tell them. But nobody is good at it. I mean, everybody has something that they have an issue with, and, you know, you just have to work on those things, I think. And, you know, poetry, I don't want to have magical thinking about it, but I have to say that the poetry comes to me when I'm ready and open. And it just doesn't come no matter what I do when I'm not, you know, when I have something going on that isn't. So I'm talking about real poetry now, you know, the poems that, you know, when you write them, they have to have been written, you know. I'm not talking about, you know, just talking on paper or churning things out, or, you know, I mean, the real ones. I like to save up the real ones, and I try not to pad my manuscripts with too many ones that are just there to be another page, you know. I ask myself that about poems all the time. Are you here to just be a page, or do you really need to be here? You know, one way you can test in a book is to see what the relation is between all your poems and each other, you know. Do you have anything in common with anybody in this room, you say, about the poem, you know? And if so, it's a good test. If you read it aloud and you feel something, it's a good test. So what else would you like to?
Carolyn, I read about in an interview recently that I came across that you mentioned that the kernel was actually not supposed to be in the manuscript of The Country Between Us, that Professor Albright of Yale, that he pulled it out and said, this is the best poem. And you said, that's not supposed to be there. Can you speak about that And do talk about the Colonel, because Alan Grossman suggested that poems create poets. And that obviously is a poem that has created you, at least in terms of the way you're known to most people in the world.
Well, that poem became very notorious, you know. It was, the whole book was published at a time when Americans were just starting to pay attention to El Salvador in a big way. It was in the press. The poems were written long before that. But they were in a drawer because an editor told me they were too political and I shouldn't publish them. And so by the time Margaret Atwood got angry with me that they were in the drawer and I got a publisher for them, it was magically just the right time if you want people to read. I mean, for me, it was a nightmare because it was just a nightmare. But the Colonel poem, I wrote the Colonel poem so that I wouldn't forget details about that event, because I thought someday, of course, I promised I would write about this, and I thought it was going to be a prose book, you know, so I need to remember details. And I wrote that thing, and it shaped really, it just got shaped, it shaped itself. And I put it in a folder, and it got mixed up with the poems. Dan Albright, Yeats scholar, was teaching at UVA then, so was I. And I liked Dan, and I thought he knew a lot about poetry. He certainly knew a lot about Yeats. So I asked him to read my manuscript, and he read it and said, this is the strongest poem in the whole thing. And I said, oh, no, that's a mistake. So that's what happened. And he made me leave it in. And sure enough, that poem, originally published in Pequod, which I don't know if it's still publishing, but that poem, which I never thought was a big deal, it certainly wasn't the worst thing I'd seen in Salvador by any means, you know. I didn't think it was a big deal of a poem, but the world did. So I had to deal with that. And it was not written as a prose poem. It was written as a piece of prose. I know that it got shaped by my imagination somehow, by my form, you know. It's a box, it has a light in it that's hanging from a cord, you know, but it wasn't my intention when I wrote it. That was just something that happened while I was writing it. And the Colonel himself, well, that's a complicated story. Lionel told me years later that he had shown the poem to the Colonel. I was shocked. I said, why did you do that? What got into you? What happened? And he said, oh, he liked it. He loved the poem. He was really proud of being in a poem. And so he laminated it and he takes it with him and shows people. I said, he's proud of that poem? Yes, he's in a poem. And then he died, and 5 other officers from that period in Salvador were going around telling people they were the Colonel. bragging. I was the one who did that to that American, you know. None of them were the Colonel. So it was a very strange kind of thing altogether. And then finally, I got accused of making it up because nobody would cut off ears, right? Nobody would keep ears that they had cut off. So I was inventing. And then Doug Farrar of the Washington Post brought me a clipping and he said, you might want to put this in your stuff. You might want to keep this. And it was a story he'd written about the tradition of cutting off ears in the Salvadoran military and how it was ubiquitous in the time that I was there. He said, that'll help you to defend yourself. So that's all I have to say about that.
Wow. Well, if you could give us a reading of the Colonel, I would appreciate it. I mean, I have, of course, come across various readings of it on the internet, but it is
Okay.
a poem that wow. I mean, I feel like Lionel really absolutely achieved his vision by bringing you as a poet to El Salvador, to knowing, as Shelley declared, that poets are the unacknowledged legislators of the world, because that poem is news that stays news. It's going to be read in 100 years from now. I am certain of that, Carolyn.
Okay. This book is the memoir, and it is the backstory of the Colonel poem, but it's got Lionel as the main character. He's funny, brilliant, mysterious, maddening, you know, he's all kinds of things. He's a very complex character, and And it's the story of my time there and actually what happened, which I'd never told people, you know, fully. I never talked about this until it was published in 2019. And there's a reference to the Colonel poem in it, but I hope you'll read it. But this is the Colonel poem. What you have heard is true. I was in his house. His wife, oh, ironically, my parrot is now talking down. Can you hear her? Yeah. Okay, she's got to be in this poem. The Colonel, what you have heard is true. I was in his house. His wife carried a tray of coffee and sugar. His daughter filed her nails. His son went out for the night. There were daily papers, pet dogs, a pistol on the cushion beside him. The moon swung bare on its black cord over the house. On the television was a cop show. It was in English. Broken bottles were embedded in the walls around the house to scoop the kneecaps from a man's legs or cut his hands to lace. On the windows, there were gratings like those in liquor stores. We had dinner, rack of lamb, good wine. A gold bell was on the table for calling the maid. The maid brought green mangoes, salt, a type of bread. I was asked how I enjoyed the country. There was a brief commercial in Spanish. His wife took everything away. There was some talk then of how difficult it had become to govern. The parrot said hello on the terrace. The Colonel told it to shut up and pushed himself from the table. My friend said to me with his eyes, say nothing. The Colonel returned with a sack used to bring groceries home. He spilled many human ears on the table. They were like dried peach halves. There is no other way to say this. He took one of them in his hands, shook it in our faces, dropped it into a water glass. It came alive there. I am tired of fooling around, he said. As for the rights of anyone, tell your people they can go fuck themselves. He swept the ears to the floor with his arm and held the last of his wine in the air. Something for your poetry, no? He said. Some of the ears on the floor caught this scrap of his voice. Some of the ears on the floor were pressed to the ground. San Salvador, May 1978. So there's the Colonel poem. I probably should have read it earlier in the session rather than leaving you with it, but
Incredibly powerful way to end. Amazing. Thank you
well,
so much.
do you have anything else you would like to say, any of you, or to ask?
Just thank you so much. Thank you so much for reading and for talking. And I always appreciate your sort of the stories you tell to introduce the poems because they add a whole lot of perspective.
Well, that's a controversial thing to do, you know, with poetry.
I know. Some people are very critical of it, but I appreciate it. I like it.
I've tried it the other way without doing it.
Right.
And sometimes I vary it, you know, I don't always, I pick a few that I'll talk about and then not, you know, but I like stories. And some of the stories they're not in the poem. They're just stuff around the poem. And so thank you that you like them. I found out that I like writing prose too. I used to think I wouldn't because even though I wrote short stories in high school, once I became devoted to poetry, I just didn't want to write in sentences, you know, unless, and I found out that I like it, and I like dialogue, which I never would have thought I would like. I like making scenes. The memoir reads a little bit like a thriller, a little bit like a mystery. It kind of cribs from all different kinds of genres. It was my first prose book. I never took a class in writing prose. I didn't know anything about it. And that was a big problem because I could make sentences and paragraphs, but I didn't know anything about structure. If you're going to write a prose book, you have to know about structure. So that's why there were 4 versions. The structure kept failing. And then finally it worked. So, okay, thank you for coming. And
Carolyn, may I ask you one quick thing? Sorry. This
Sure.
may not be something you'll ever have time for because you are you, but first, thank you so much. I work with a poetry podcast group called the Hive Poetry Collective in Santa Cruz, California. And my most recent recorded conversation, which reaches a lot of people, was with Brenda Hillman. And Rodrigo Toscano and others, but this is, this kind of this work between the personal and the political, so to speak, and that's a reduction. It's something I'm very interested in, and I tend to ask questions that don't go on for 3 years. Sorry for that last one. But if you're ever interested or have time, maybe Lucian could put us in touch if you're open to that.
Sure.
And I understand if you're not being busy as you are. Thank you.
I can do that at some point. This, I'm teaching still. I'm not retired.
Yeah.
So the world is a little busy right now, but that slackens up in the summer.
Yeah,
Like it does
hear you.
for anybody who's teaching.
Okay.
It's my 50th year of teaching.
Whoa.
Wow.
Yeah.
No,
Yeah.
I know. Well, I'm not counting a couple years I had off for sabbatical or whatever, but I started teaching in 1973 as a grad student, but so it was 2023 that was the 50th, marked the 50th year. Most of those years I taught, and I love it.
What sustains you as a teacher? Because I can admit I've only been teaching seriously poetry for the last 5 years, and I can already feel hints of burnout at moments. How do you sustain it?
Well, one thing I do is I try to change how I'm teaching or change the materials, and I try not to repeat too much for my own sake. I will say that just between us, I was keeping up with the generations until about 6 years ago. I felt like I could understand. I understand the age group 18 to 22. I'm like a 5th grade teacher who knows the 5th grade, right? And so I knew this age group, and they really change a lot in those 4 years. So, and I really loved that age group. I liked working with them, but I find that we don't have the same references. We're nowhere near each other in history. I have to, it's harder to pull commonalities, to be able to talk to them in a way that allows them to feel familiar references, then, I started not to be able to keep up with them. I can keep up with poetry. But I like talking about their work. It's just not as fluid as it used to be. And they really are growing up in a completely different world than I did. Completely. And one of the problems is that my generation, I'm a boomer. I was born 5 years after the war. We sort of sometimes make the mistake of thinking that they're, that we can apply how it was for us to them, and none of it almost applies. So it's been an interesting process. What I do is I try to engage, trying to learn about them, learn how they think, that helps with the burnout. And this, I love the Z's. The Z's are very committed. They really want to heal the world. They're political, but they're not in that narrow way political, They know that they have got to save the environment or they're not going to have long lifespans, They're very serious about that part, even more so than the millennials. But, they know I like them, but they also know that I'm losing touch, and I forget things in the middle of class, and then they have to tell me, oh, you were just saying this, or yeah. That's embarrassing. But I don't want to stop yet, so. Yeah. Don't worry about burnout. It comes and goes. Take a break. Try to get a sabbatical if they still give them. You know? And try to change it up all the time. Change what you're doing. Okay?
Good
And
advice.
you guys all take care and get through the winter, those of you who are wintering.
Thank you
And,
so much, Carolyn. You are awesome.
2024. Get through 2024. It's going to be a tough year,
Yes,
right?
but we
God.
gotta get through
We're
it.
ready, right? We're ready for it. So, okay. Take care.
Well, thank
Thank
you
you,
for
Thank you
Carolyn.
so
giving
much.
us such a gift
Gracias.
beginning of this year, Carolyn. You've lifted
Yes.
our whole year. You've given us this blossoming geyser of your spirit, and it's just going to continue to
Well
ripple
said.
out. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.